Okay, so we have to start on time because we are connected to the digital world. So I would like to welcome everyone here in this room and elsewhere as well. A warm welcome to all being now here and to all being in the digital nowhere. It's an extraordinary privilege and honor to welcome the directors of the Estate of Gordon Matta-Clark, Jane Crawford and Jessamyn Fiore. Furthermore, Martien de Vletter, Deputy Director of the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal, Katrin Aste, where is she? Over there. Architect, professor, and director of the Institute for Experimental Architecture, University of Innsbruck, Hans Schabus, the first row here, internationally renowned artist and professor for sculpture and space at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna, Brussels-based curator and writer Yann Chateigné, also in the first row here. And last but not least, Jürgen Tabor, curator of the Generali Foundation collection and person in charge for the second venue of the Gordon Matta-Clark exhibition and this symposium. My name is Thorsten Sadowsky, and I'm the director of the Museum der Moderne Salzburg. In his radical, socially critical, and innovative work, Gordon Matta-Clark was one of the most significant figures from the New York art scene at the late 1960s and 1970s. His building cuts, in which he cut through and transformed vacant buildings employing sometimes radical gestures, achieved widespread recognition. At the same time, social and ecological considerations also played a central role in his thinking and his artistic practice. The connection between body, space, architecture, nature, social processes, and practices as recycling and cooking situates him as an artist who was and remains a constant source of inspiration for artists and architects alike. Yesterday, we opened in Salzburg the exhibition Out of the Box, Gordon Matta-Clark, and today we want to talk about the artistic practice of one of the most important artists of the late 20th century. I would like to take the opportunity to express my gratitude for the excellent cooperation with the CCA and the Estate of Gordon Matta-Clark. There is a close connection of anarchy and architecture in the work of this charismatic rebel, as the show of the Bronx Museum in New York emphasized in 2017. Matta-Clark, the son of American artist Anne Clark and surrealist Chilean painter Roberto Matta, was trained as an architect, like his father. However, unlike the father, who moved to painting after having worked a short period with Le Corbusier, Matta-Clark didn't abandon the field of architecture. On the contrary, he shed a light on the failures of modernism. As he said, we can see the whole problem of modernity and the international style proliferation and the development of post-war American imperialism. This architecture mirrors the Western capitalistic axis iconography. I'm against this abuse of Bauhaus and its initial purist ideals. As a second issue, the symposium wants to give deeper insights in the work with archives and collections. The key question is, as Francesco Garuti, the project director of the Out of the Box Gordon Matta-Clark exhibition, so aptly said, how can we transform research from involving archival material from analysis of aesthetic history into strategies of interpretation and activating the presence? And in what ways can the traditional linear procedure of processing an archive, inventory, preserve, catalog, study, reproduce, display, be transformed to foster a deeper, more critical readings of its content? These are the questions, or some of the questions, we will talk about this afternoon. I wish us and wish you all a fruitful and inspiring discussion, and may hand over to Jürgen Tabor. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. A warm welcome to you also from my part. I'm pleased about the lively interest we have, and I think that we will gain some interesting, exciting insights into the exhibition, into the work of the involved institutions, curators, artists, and above all, of course, insight into the artistic thinking of Gordon Matta-Clark. I will also give a short introduction now into the exhibition and then into the program of the symposium. As we have heard, Matta-Clark was one of the most significant, interesting artists of his time. His work was critical, it was radical and innovative. His life was brief but extremely productive, and he developed a complex oeuvre, one can say, in which he engaged himself for a new understanding of art as a social practice, on the one side. On the other side, his building cuts are part of his best-known works, these rigorous interventions in which he opened up spatial structures, in which he unbuilt entire buildings. So the engagement with space, with social space, but also architectural space, and this is not separated, it's connected, of course, has a central position in Matta-Clark's art. He was trained as an architect and implemented radical transformations of buildings in cities like New York, Paris, and Antwerp to show, to manifest, to register his objection to massive failings of urban architecture and land use planning of his time and also of our time. It's an objection to the poor quality of life in purely functionalist architecture, an economy of urban design that conceived architecture as no more than an array of containers and cells. It is an objection to manipulation, speculation, gentrification, and the social exclusion wrought by the deliberate neglect of certain urban neighborhoods. So Matta-Clark's interventions were a crucial contribution to a critical examination of prevailing conventions of architecture under social, economic, and ethical, but also physical and spatial aspects. And they have lost none of their relevance today. So with these legendary deconstructions, but also with his early collective food project, restaurant project, food, with his performances, which were, if you see the films, they were always organized as social spaces, with his use of film and photography for doing research on architecture, and with his deep interest in questions of ecology. So Matta-Clark was and still is a source of inspiration for architects and artists alike. The Out of the Box exhibition offers new insight into Matta-Clark's thinking. As we heard, it is based on the extensive collections and archives which are held at the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal and also at the Generali Foundation at the Museum der Moderne in Salzburg. And it is the first presentation of this three-part research and exhibition program that in Europe that was organized by the CCA in 2019 and 2020. The CCA has invited 3 curators with different and art historians, film historians with different backgrounds to explore Matta-Clark's archive. This was Yann Chateigné, Hilla Pelek, and Kitty Scott. And they had the chance to work with highly revealing archival materials like personal correspondence, sketchbooks, private photographs, Matta-Clark's personal library, and unseen film footage. So, and the exhibition gives for the first time the public the opportunity to examine a selection of these documents and in connection with important artworks from Matta-Clark, from both collections, from the CCA and from Generali Foundation. And to enliven this dialogue between the collections, the Generali Foundation has invited the artist Hans Schabus to reflect on our Matta-Clark archive and collection, but from his perspective of an artist. Schabus' work is characterized by a conceptual, architectural, sculptural, and social thinking, which has certain relations to Matta-Clark's thinking, to my mind. And he has created a project which is very interesting, I think, which includes several parts and is based on to my mind, on an empathetic approach to Matta-Clark. So what we have here in our out-of-the-box exhibition is an exhibition in 4 chapters about Matta-Clark as an artist, but also it's also an exhibition about archival work, and it shows new ways of making archives productive resources for our present. So I'm pleased to welcome 5 great speakers for today's symposium. We have 2 panels. The first panel will focus on the exhibition and its context, and the second panel will focus on Matta-Clark's influence on art and architecture. First, we will have Martien de Vletter, Deputy Director of Collections at the CCA in Montreal. She will give an insight into the work at this institution, the collection work. It is one of the most prestigious international research institutions for architecture, and she will also situate the work on the Matta-Clark archive in this context. Then I'm pleased to welcome art historian and curator Yann Chateigné. He has been studying Matta-Clark's personal library and has developed an exhibition chapter focusing on this library, and we will hear what he has learned from his pursuit. Then I will have a discussion, a talk with artist Hans Schabus about the project that he has developed for our exhibition here and for the Generali Foundation. And at the end of the first panel, I would propose to have a short discussion, which is also open for questions, of course. In the second panel, we will, we're thrilled to welcome Jessamyn Fiore. She's director of the estate, co-director of the Estate of Matta-Clark, and a deep, profound Matta-Clark expert, and she will speak about Matta-Clark's influence on social practices in the arts. And finally, the great architect and Professor Katrin Aste will speak from her perspective on the relevance of Matta-Clark for architecture, and this also in relation to the Austrian context. I thank you very much for your attention. Already now, wish us exciting insights, and may I now ask Martien de Vletter, please, to take the podium. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to speak a little bit about what the Gordon Matta-Clark archive means to the CCA and for us. We're very grateful for the collection at the CCA. It is, let me see, yeah. So what you just saw was the front of the CCA. I'm just going to first situate the CCA a little bit for you in Montreal, which is very far away for some. and which was the front. The photo that you saw could have been taken yesterday because the hedges are as red now as they were in the fall of 2004, when actually this exhibition opened, out of the first exhibition, Out of the Box, opened as a new format at the CCA, where we really unpacked the archives that we then recently received, the archive of Aldo Rossi, James Sterling, Cedric Price, and Gordon Matta-Clark. And we did the Gordon Matta-Clark archive unpacking, let's say, with Mark Wigley at the time. And it was exhibited for a couple of months. It then went back to the archivist, who started really working on processing the archive. So what you see here is, in a way, a second Out of the Box, a different one, with 3 different voices, as Jürgen said, that are, again, looking at the archive from different perspectives. So this was the exhibition in 2004. I won't spend too much time, but you can see this kind of, let's say, already a different way. This was obviously in 2004, so a long time ago. It had a very archival approach, and this quote of Gordon Matta-Clark is still at our entrance. So we moved it from the exhibition gallery to the entrance of the staff entrance, in fact. And so to remind everyone working at the CCA that confusion is good. It was a revolutionary exhibition in many ways at the CCA, which was a very, how would I say, a very serious institution. It still is, but you see the wall texts were just with some tape. This was really unusual at the time at the CCA. So I always like to show this image because it did not only kind of start, it was not only the kind of out-of-the-box exhibition, was not only a different curatorial format for the CCA, it really also started with a director who then was just appointed, Mirko Tardini, a really different era at the CCA where we tried to loosen up a bit, I would say a bit. This, on the other hand, is the first exhibition in 2019, the first edition of the 3 exhibitions. This one is of Yann, as you can see, with a little bit of the books behind the door. And here we go back to the archival situation of the 2004 exhibition. So the out-of-the-box format, we used it now for several other exhibitions as well. We used it for an exhibition on the archive of Abalos and Herreros, a Spanish firm with 3 different architects. Here you see the 2 architects of soil and the Spanish architect who worked on it. And it really shows, in a way, I think it's similar to, there's many images already of the 3 curators that were doing their work for this exhibition, so I thought to choose another one. This is really what it is about. You really try to dive into the archive to find narratives that you are curious about maybe when you start, but it's revealing more once you really look at the objects. I think this is really crucial for us to really centralize the collections or the archives. And this is one of the installation photos of the show that Yann put together. And the show. And then this was the last one was one of the photos of the Hila Pelek show, and this is the Kitty Scott installation, which you also see here. Now I go back to the CCA. So where the way the archive, I think, of the collection of Gordon Matta-Clark is positioned, we call it a collection, because strictly speaking, archivists tell me this, it is not an archive because it wasn't created by the creator himself or herself. So we have archives of many people that I will show you later. So the Gordon Matta-Clark collection, as we call it, was mainly put together by Jane Crawford, and in an incredible way. is, you know, what's in the name, but so we call it the collection, and it lives inside the CCA collection, where we have a library collection of about 250,000 publications on architecture, urbanism, landscape design, design to a certain way as well. And within that collection, we also have a toy collection that you see here, a miniature collection, a large collection of DVDs and films, a postcard collection, so many different other sub-collections, as you could say. Prints and drawings, we have about 60,000 prints and drawings at the CCA, which is, I always call this the collection of bits and pieces, which is not very nice to say, because these bits and pieces are actually really, really interesting, with, let's say, going from 16th century drawings of Scamozzi or Palladio to the 20th century drawings of Isozaki, as we will see. But it's really, let's say, individual objects, like, as I said, one of those, the Scamozzi design for the Salzburg Cathedral, which I thought was nice to show to you. We only have one drawing of Scamozzi. I've been told by people that really know Scamozzi's work very well that it is one of the best drawings. And it tells you something about how I think the collections all sometimes make no sense to each other, and sometimes they do. A drawing by Isozaki, which is a competition design for the Tokyo City Hall. We have many archives, over 200 archives by now, including a lot of Born Digital archives, which has its own complexity that I will not go into today. So we have the archive of Peter Eisenman, which is very large. As I was saying, the archive of Cedric Price, which is, together with Gordon Matta-Clark, the most popular material at the time. So this goes in trends. We see the trends coming and going, of course. When we received the Cedric Price archive, it was not of much interest at all. And we see now that it has really gained interest a lot, especially not only among architecture students or architects, but it'll also be among artists and critics. Our photo collection is about 60,000 photos and really documents photography as a medium, as well as architecture in photography. Obviously, there's a lot of links with the work of Gordon Matta-Clark, but it also stands as a collection in itself. This is a photo by Robert Burley, a Canadian photographer, who we gave a commission in the 90s to, together with Lee Friedlander, and Jeffrey James, to document all the Olmsted projects. It's an incredible commission of we have about 1,200 works for this entire commission, and the three of them documented all of the parks and the works of Olmsted, of which one of them is in Montreal, which I guess explains a bit of the interest. And it continues to be a really remarkable, let's say, series of photographs. Another entirely different photograph of Catherine Wagner, again a commission by the CCA for an exhibition that related to Disney, which was, let's say, in the 1990s as well. We obviously use our materials for a lot of open sessions, which we also do now remotely, for those of you who are interested. We put together with professors a lot of materials. Can be about one collection or archive, can also be across archives and collections. So then the Gordon Matta-Clark archive or collection. I think it is really, I often call it papers, the Gordon Matta-Clark papers, because it's not, sometimes people are disappointed when they come to the CCA because we don't have many of the artworks, but it's really his personal papers. And this makes it so special and unique. We have a lot of these cards that Mark Wigley and Wendy Owens will publish a book, I think, on very soon. And it really documents, let's say, his life up until his death and beyond. As I said, Jane Crawford created the archive and then also collected a lot of the, let's say, additional or ephemeral materials. But a lot of this collection refers to his personal life, with letters to his parents and to many, many other people. Sometimes there's architectural drawings inside those letters, which are, I think, very telling. We have drawings too in the collection, not an awful lot, but a good amount. But it also requires time to go through this collection. You have to understand how the pieces fit together. It is accessible online. You can find the finding aid. You can go through the different series. I think there are about 10 series, and you can read the descriptions of these series. We've digitized a lot, but certainly not everything. And I think what fascinates me about this work is that it is not really, to have this archive is not really to rewrite the legacy ourselves of Gordon Matta-Clark, but make it available to others, to expand the terrain, not just to architects or architectural students, but to anyone who comes to the CCA. I think what you can read in all these documentations is that, let's say, splitting is not just a house cut in two. It has a lot more, let's say, connotations, or it has a context that you will find in this archive and not anywhere else. Although I do say that the cuttings of Hila Pelek have really given me a new reading of the papers, or the films in her case, which is again another way for us to investigate or to connect with this archive or collection, to invite others to make certain things that are already inside, but they make it more explicit in ways that, for example, archivists don't do, who are trying to be factual about their descriptions. I think the archive, in a way, shows the social fabric around all these projects, and the margins of the work, which will become the center in certain cases, depending on who is researching it, and which is one of the many reasons why I think this collection is interesting, and also why it fits very well at the CCA. I also like what Francesco said yesterday at the opening, where he kind of alluded on the fact that the collection of Gordon Matta-Clark is kind of off time. It's not really about the project, it's about what happened before, what happened around and after, which gives you a very different way of looking to this material. Obviously, you can see some of the projects themselves, especially in the films, but it also allows for a lot of other narratives to appear, which, as I said before, would not otherwise appear. This, by the way, is one of the materials that was very difficult to find for us. I think it was in your show, Yann, or in the so I know that you knew it was there, and we thought, yeah, so where exactly did we put this? Because it was really well packed, and we really had to look for it. And it's such an unusual museum object, as you can imagine, that it took us a while to find it and to make it available for the exhibition. Obviously, the library is a very important part of the collection as well, which I think we did not take serious enough, I have to say, at the CCA in the beginning. So it was great when Yann came and explored this in much more detail, because again, it told us a lot of stories that we could kind of integrate in the finding aid after. And another aspect I would like to point out is that in many ways the archive of, or the collection of Gordon Matta-Clark has become the center for the CCA collection. It kind of has a lot of different ways where you can start at the Gordon Matta-Clark collection and then end up in the Cedric Price collection, or even the Alvaro Siza archive. But what you can also do in the archive is fact-checking, which I think is also an important aspect of an archive, to be precise as possible in our case. Obviously, researchers will take their own research, but if we wanted to, we could go back to the original papers and to understand if things had gone in a certain way. One, if it is if there is, of course, some documents about that in the archive. But I do think there is something about the precision that an archive can offer. I'm all for speculation and for curators who take the archive and build their own narratives, but I do think it is important also to go back to the papers and to see it as the written kind of legacy, but also the written, let's say, factual information. Even in the case of Gordon Matta-Clark, there's a lot of room for speculation, and there's a lot of room for different narratives. I think this was the last one. Yeah, so I go back, so you have something to see. So I want to hold it here because I know there's many stories about other parts of the archive, so I don't want to spoil. Is it Jan now? Yeah.
So I just navigate with. Hello, good afternoon. Thanks for having me here, trying to tell you a little bit more about the exhibition. I hope you had the possibility to visit it already, or if not, I hope you will have the possibility to visit it, perhaps between the two panels or later in the afternoon. I decided not to show pictures of the exhibition because it's always difficult to document, and it kills a little bit also, I think, the joy of the live experience of art. I decided to gather a few working pictures that I took with my phone during the research I did in Montreal. So I was very lucky to be invited for a short residency, something like 2-3 years from now. It was my first and last residency, actually, until now. It's pretty rare for a curator to be invited in residence somewhere, and it's even more rare to have this possibility to really have time to research and to really focus for a period of time on one subject and really dig into some material to produce something new out of this investigation. So I was very happy to be invited to immerse myself in this material, and came out of this super intense week, a little bit more than a week of research, this project, Material Thinking, that tried to sort of change a little bit the perspective on Matta-Clark's work through the exhibition of his personal, actually one part of the collection of his personal book of non-fiction. I used to know, of course, Matta-Clark for many years, but I'm not what I should call a Matta-Clarkian. I'm not an expert in his work, and I was trained as an art historian and a museum curator, but I also moved a little bit away from the museum field, something like 15 years or between 10 and 15 years ago, to dedicate myself to art education and, I would say, educational engineering by working in an art school and being more an educator, a researcher, and an organizer of, I would say, forms of I don't know, maybe not radical, but alternative experimental pedagogies. So I was very interested in Matta-Clark's thinking. I was interested in his work, of course, but I was also very interested in what he was writing, what he was telling about his work, the conversations that he had with other artists, and also the conversations that he had with other thinkers. So the personal library was really, when I discovered that all the books were stored in Montreal, a way to understand the conceptual, the philosophical, the richness of his own thinking. And what I did is that I sort of selected in the collection some specific works, documents, archival material, things that sometimes we didn't really know what it was. Was it a work, or was it a document? Was it a remain of something? That is one of the most interesting things when you work with and in an archive, is that the objects, sometimes they have a sort of ambiguous status. You don't really know if it's a trace of something, if it's a note for a project to come, if it's a work in itself. And as many times you go and look again, and as time passes, every time there's a new reading of the status of this object. And I was very interested to go into this archive and to look at it from a sort of new perspective, from a new context, to recontextualize some of the documents that were in the archive and that were presented in the literature that I had the possibility to read, sometimes in a different angle, because the context changes and the meaning of the work changes. I've been working with Matta-Clark's work since now, I think, a little bit more than 10 years. And for the first time, it was in the context of an exhibition that I co-curated at the Pompidou Center in Paris, the National Museum of Art, invited in the context of a sort of series of carte blanche for emerging curators. So at the time, I was still emerging. I hope I'm not totally done with this form of emergence, but I was quite young, and I wanted to reflect on my own relationship with this museum, because this is where I had my first professional experience as an intern making photocopies for the director at the time, being a sort of, observer and learning from doing with more experienced curators. But I was also very critical already at the time about the way the museum was more and more closed, more and more privatized, and becoming more and more museified in a way. And I felt it was a sort of contradiction with the discourse of the architect who designed it in the 1970s as a so-called open series of platforms with a sort of fluid transition between the inside and the outside, between the public and the private, and between the art and real life. And the idea of the exhibition, that was called Fun Palace, as an homage to Cedric Price, started with this very strange fact, is that the Fun Palace by Cedric Price, an experimental but unrealized project of a museum that was always transforming, always open, closing, multidisciplinary, sort of utopian museum, was a sort of source for the Pompidou Center, but it was never sort of mentioned in the official discourse of the museum, and Cedric Price wasn't even present in the collection. So we worked with my co-curators friends on this sort of unconscious of the museum, and the perfect image and the perfect example of this work with the unconscious of the museum was this hole dug by Matta-Clark in a building just near the Pompidou, Rue Beaubourg, where he digged this conic hole in an abandoned building to sort of create a sort of tension with this other hole, gigantic hole that was dug a few hundred meters away from this place to implement this sort of temple by the right-wing president at the time, Pompidou. expropriating thousands of people, workers, precarious persons, artists, alternative thinkers. All this life of this poor area was thrown away by the construction of this sort of, I don't know, liberal empire and temple for contemporary culture that looked like actually more than a sort of open space, looked more like a factory. Anyway, so I worked with Matta-Clark and his thinking, his archive, his films at the time, and we showed these documents. And we showed these films where he was digging and looking at what was below the city. So this is Sous-sol de Paris, a film that he did at the very end of his working period. Looking at was below, we were looking at was outside. It was this idea to work with the margins to reveal the infrastructure and the thinking of this institution. So for the project here and in Montreal, I really wanted to try to change a little bit the way Matta-Clark's work was shown, because most of the exhibitions and books that I've been reading were showing traces of actual projects that happened before. So the archive and the works documented something that had already happened. So there was a sort of I might call a sort of reification of the archive, a sort of things that needed for me to be revived. So I had this intuition that perhaps we could work with the archive at not something that was a proof of something that happened, but that was a trace of a process. That was something that could be a sort of in-betweenness, in between the work, in between the thinking and the work, something that would be more turned towards the future than towards a sort of imagined past. So I selected all the books. So all the books from the collection are presented here. And I created a sort of atlas. But the idea was not to show the archive horizontally as it is mostly shown in exhibition, because the horizontal, and especially in relation with Matta-Clark's work, would too much refer to a form of, I don't know, a form of death, something that really like connects the archive with the idea of lying on the ground or something that was desactivated. So the idea was to show the books and the documents frontally as works of art or as something that could stand in front of you and then you can have a sort of dialogue with it. And I devised a series of 4 what I called constellations around the major sort of groups of books that we found in the collection. The first constellation revolves around this idea of alchemy and magic and the occult that is very, very present in many works of actually Matta-Clark. There was a paper published in the 1970s by an art historian talking about Matta-Clark and a few other artists as alchemists. And actually, it was not only a metaphor, it was really something that was a practice for him to transform things, transform context, to transform materials, like in his project, one of the most famous early works that he did for his first exhibition in New York. He took this photograph and he fried it and melted it with gold leaf to make this alchemical object that was sent as a gift to his friends. And it's really this idea that a work is made out of this sort of a live transformation. An exhibition a work is composed of a set of ingredients to produce something that is a sort of shared ritual. A work of art has to be experienced collectively and create a moment of sharing. And this is also one of the meaning of one of his great work that he did with Jane Gooden, who was also a choreographer. So the food project was, in the meantime, a restaurant. So it was a sort of course, architecture, but it was also a social construction. And the second constellation derives from this one around this idea of network and the relationship that he has in this work with the social fabric of the city, conceived as a network that can be reconnected differently, or that could be disrupted, through which you can dig these holes to navigate it differently and create open spaces, errors, other forms of connectivities, human connectivities, connectivities with light, with air, with nature, with others. And this comes from his deep understanding and great interest in the cybernetic theories, the computer science, the communication studies that he has in his library, and the discussion he had with others about this, that you can find in works like Pipes, for an example, where he photographed the whole network of tubes that were hidden behind the walls, that was behind the walls of a museum, and that he showed in the museum as a sort of skeleton or a sort of futuristic mechanic being, revealing the invisible infrastructure where the heat, the water, everything that's hidden in a museum was shown as an exhibition. He was admiring, I guess, Buckminster Fuller, because Fuller, the great thinker architect you all know, of course, is certainly one of the most present in his personal library as a reference. So you will see in the exhibition, or you have seen this, sometimes conceptual, sometimes visual, material connections, formal connections that are between also the design of the book and actually the works that are presented, or the projects. The third constellation, I called it gravity, and it has to do with the connection in his work between his very deep understanding of the history and theory of modern architecture as a former student of Cornell, where he studied modern architecture in relation with the context, and his great interest as an artist, and his practice in the context of his artist collective and architecture of performance and dance, because lots of works by Matta-Clark could be considered as performances, as sort of anthropological gestures, very simple tasks, as in, I don't know, Anna Halprin or Simone Forti, Trisha Brown's choreographies, or Yvonne Reiner, of just cutting something, splitting something. These very simple gestures that are shared in different periods of our times and human activities and different cultures. So the work that he did of revealing space, opening buildings, working with light and air and weight and gravity was, in a way, not only a critique of what he called the containerization of our lives by architecture, but also an homage to the relationship that modern architecture or modern visions, modern utopias had with this idea of materiality in architecture. So this kind of works, so an example is very interesting because it's, in the meantime, about what's present, what's absent, as in performance or dance or theater. It's about the inside and the outside. It's about your own position as a viewer. Where do you sit, inside or outside? So it poses the question of you as a subject, as someone who has to perform architecture again. And he was also having a whole series of books about archaeology, ancient cultures, non-Western forms of construction, vernacular architecture, so architecture without architects, remains, traces, abandoned sites, lots of photographs of ruins, of excavation sites. So the act of digging as well is a sort of choreographical also gesture in his work. And in the end, I was fascinated to realize how much his work had to do with space, of course, with a form of critique of our relationship with space, and how the urban infrastructure, the power structures, the economy, the speculation is controlling our lives, is controlling our space, is controlling our mode of being, but also it's really haunted by a sort of extremely experimental relationship with time. And when you look at an archive so many years ago after the death of an artist, so many years after the works have been done and disappeared in a way, the only access we have is through these traces that we get and that we have in our hands when we manipulate the archive. And so many years after all these, experiments from the 1970s that look like so much historical today, and how fresh they are, how important they are to show again and to share again, and how important it is to inhabit these visions. And in his work, there is always this sort of attempt to revitalize our relationship with time, as in these drawings of arrows. It's really this time that goes in every direction all the time, against the linearity of time, the containerization of time, against this way to consider time as blocks that are one after each other and divided the way one's is experiencing time, especially in our times where perhaps even more intensively since the beginning of the pandemic, our relationship with technologies and time has been more and more controlled. The last constellation is about inner spaces, and it shows his reading of psychoanalysis, mind studies, brain studies, everything that has to do with the unconscious, and how he was constantly trying to look into the inside of things, the unconscious of architecture, the unconscious of urban ideology. And it's also based on a lot of evocations in the archive that we found of his own relationship with his family and friends and acquaintances, and the whole emotional dimension of it, the whole personal component of his work, this sort of constant attempt to make his life a work and his work his life, to live where he was working, work where he was living, trying all the time to really connect with people, humans, situation, and transform situations from within, using a really, this gift that he had to be visibly someone that was so intensively human. I think I arrive at the end of the time, but I just wanted to very briefly mention how interesting it was to work in the exhibition with you yesterday evening, and and how interesting it was for me to realize that within these only 2 years, also my perception of Matta-Clark's work and importance has also changed again. And I was wondering, before arriving, is it still interesting, is it still urgent to show Matta-Clark, and especially his archive, as perhaps a contradictory way to experience such a work that has to be contextualized, that used to be done outside the institution, in real life, in public space, in contact with actual humans and social and political situations. And I told myself, yes, it means something, because it has to do with so many questions that we have today, so many emergencies that we have to face, and so many actions that we have to take, deconstructing things, deconstructing our relationship with the environment, with the built environment, with, I could say, economical and ideological infrastructures and power structures. It shows this force and this energy, this almost, I don't know, obsessive drive to change situation, to change what a work of art is, what is a sculpture, what is an architecture, what is an exhibition. This constant attempt to work collectively, to put himself in the situation of working with others, and not only with artists, but also with dancers, filmmakers, but also in the social sphere, to make art become something else that could be really transformative. And yeah, I think it's interesting to show this book collection, because it's not a collection. It's not a library. It's not something only to study. It's really a set of tools, something that you really used. So the books are not precious, and they are all annotated. They are almost sometimes destroyed, because he really used them. I think he brought with them in the studio. He was really considering these books not things to look at or to venerate, but really to look through. So as he was digging these holes in the actual environment and built environment, I think the show, in a way, tries to show this also formally, that these books are not to be looked at, but are really to be used to do something else, and to look through this archive, as he was suggesting that we should look through the heart of things. Thank you.
So thanks a lot, Martien, for the insights that you gave. Thanks a lot, Yann. It was also fascinating to hear about your approach and about how you work with these ambiguous materials. I also felt this a lot in dealing with the exhibition. You are not sure, is it an artwork, or is it a sketch? Is it what really is it? It's often a question that arises. So now we will change the setting into the talk with Hans Schabus. It takes 1 minute, and then we can just continue with our talk. Hans, please. It should already work, I think. Yeah. So I have the pleasure to talk with you because, yeah, I could invite you for the exhibition, and you were, yeah, and we were really lucky and happy that you agreed to our invitation to work on the archive of Gordon Matta-Clark. So I just want to say 2 or 3 words about Hans. He's a highly interesting artist, I think, who deals with questions of space, of architectural and sculptural space, but also with social space. And I think for that also the site-specific work in particular is a very important aspect of his work. He represented Austria at the Venice Biennial in 2005. It was a famous work then and still now. He transformed the Austrian pavilion into a huge and massive artificial mountain of wood and other materials. So the pavilion nearly disappeared behind below this mountain. And it was a questioning examination of the question of nature, of culture, and of architecture, of course. And there is another work that I love, which is the opposite of the Tower of Babel. It's the Shaft of Babel. It's for this intervention he cut a piece from the floor of his studio, like in the size of his body, and he started to dig into the floor. And he extracted one layer after the other until he got into the undergrounds, into the canalization of Vienna. That's also one of these works which gave to me the idea to invite Hans Schabus to work on the archive of Gordon Matta-Clark. And so my first question would be, or is, what was the things that interested you most in your first approach to Matta-Clark and his archive?
When I was introduced to the archive, I was very much interested in. I became very much interested in his letters, in his writings, in his because his letters they are. I mean, how can I say? They are such a good example to see somebody, to see to see an artist in need somehow, in some ways, his urgentness, his approach onto things, and his questioning, permanently questioning and proceeding in trying to manifest his work.
So you had the idea, the really great idea, I think, to do an artist book with all business letters by Gordon Matta-Clark from 1971 to 1978. Were you surprised that there are so many letters that he wrote?
Yes, I was surprised because at that time you had to write a letter on the typewriter, and he did this very in a very how can I say, in a very accurate way, in the following of and in the way of a business letter, So I could see that it goes in waves, like everything in those times. When he writes letters, so
it's very dense in the 1975, for example.
Yeah.
There are so many letters in January and February.
Every day,
like
during
10
winter
letters.
Times, especially during winter times. So this was interesting to see and to follow up.
Yeah, and what's really great to experience is that you. So in the book there are included only the letters that Gordon wrote himself to very different people, of course, to real estate companies looking for buildings he can work with, to tool manufacturers to producers of certain materials, to museums and galleries, to people who would support his projects. And what we can experience in by reading all these letters and going through these letters is how he struggled to be able to realize his art and his project, and how difficult it really was.
So it is. You can feel the pressure, the pressure under which circumstances he worked, and he tried to manifest his work and to find and to address it, and so and this is very artistic, I would say. It's a kind of artistic approach and proceeding, how he.
And when we talked for the preparation of the exhibition, you also said there are these two sides, which we see now also in these letters. What we know about Matta-Clark are these site-specific transformations of architecture, but there is also the other side, which was so intense, the work in the studio or in his flat, preparing all these projects and the manifestations afterwards. But there is such an intense working process that led to the realization that in fact there are really, if you look at his work or life as an artist, there are really these two sides. So maybe just one more short note. You've decided just to include the business letters that he himself wrote, but not the answers.
Yeah, so there were, I mean, slowly when I dug myself into these letters, I got the feeling that I am addressed by myself. So it is more interesting to see, to focus on his letters than on the answers. And also I further on, I tried to find out how I could make the layout of these spaces to address the how can I say, the expected, wie sagt man, Betrachter, Betrachterin auf Englisch? The viewer. The viewer, thank you, Thorsten. So the viewer, so and so it was important for me to reduce, to work on the aspect of representation, because his work is so much against representation. And I think in that sense it became, and it is very important to me also to discuss on his topic or on his perspective the how can I say, the principles of a museum. What do we do here? What is this building here for? And to whom do we speak? And do we want to speak? And all of that. And of course, in the first moment, I thought I have to find a radical answer to look onto, or to understand, to give the viewer the possibility to understand in a physical way and in a physical matter Gordon Matta-Clark's work. But then I lost track, because I recognized that he did this work and I have to find another way. And that's why I thought we have to leave all the walls empty. So we work with the walls of the former exhibition, And this is also an approach, I thought, which is interesting, that we produce a presence and a future through the past. And through the past exhibition, or through materials of the of past exhibitions, and then to build and construct a volume out of walls or like plinths that are in the more or less in the middle of the room, yeah, or like in the center of the room, and to leave the walls empty. Because the walls in a white cube, they are kind of a projection surface, and we are connected through this surface to the outside in some ways. So, and I think what I think is that it would be interesting to find a critical discussion onto the principle of such institutions, or the museum and things like that. So this was or is somehow my interest. Yeah.
Yeah. So you were talking about the also the design of the exhibition, the display. So you proposed that we should not use any kind of new material for the display, but use what is available in the museum, and that we use materials from the previous exhibition, temporary plasterboard walls that were cut into parts, into segments, and rearranged, and now used as platforms, as free platforms for the film works, for conceptual works by Matta-Clark, and for the archive of Matta-Clark. And maybe we talk about this room, this very let's say reduced minimalistic space, a room for meditation in a way. There you suggested to show the written legacy that we have got in 2001 by Jane Crawford as a gift, the written legacy of Gordon Matta-Clark, his correspondence, notebooks, and we received it in photocopy to be able to work with it, and now we could make the artist's book out of it with his letters by Gordon Matta-Clark, and you also suggested to show this archive, which consists of 24 folders, yeah, do you want to add something? Do you want to say about the concept of this space?
Of this space in general, or of the three?
Of this installation, or this setting, with the archive and the letter that you chose.
Yeah. So first of all, we tried to find like like in every space to have this pile of walls where we present the topics, the monitors. So the idea was to present all his films, to show all his films, and then all the works from the physical works from the collection, and in the other room the archive, just the folders. And so and for me this was interesting to have these three how can I say this, three views on his work: the archive, the physical works, and these films, and with the archive, I wanted to show just one letter out of this correspondence. It is his last letter that he wrote like a few weeks before he died, and this letter is very interesting because he is he's writing about the relation between himself as a rotten artist, as he writes, and the beauty of Blumenstrauß, was heißt das?
A bouquet of flowers.
A booklet flowers, yes. So and I think this is also a kind of basic. It can be a basic metaphor for his work, also. Yeah, the beauty that is also that the beauty also can be a topic to discuss in his work. Yeah. So the beauty of derelict buildings, the beauty of I don't know, making something out of nothing, the beauty of industrial ruins, of leftover industrial buildings and housing and so on. Yeah, like buildings that are being on the borders of our, or that like, I don't know, yeah, das sogenannte Treibgut unserer Gesellschaft, yeah. Don't know the words in English, and so there is a beauty in these things, yeah. and in his last letters he formulates this, yeah, and it's a crucial like connection, I would say.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah,
and I wanted, just to have nothing else on these walls, on all the walls, just this letter, to make it a kind of to get or to reach a sort of physical moment also for the viewer.
That has a real influence on the experience of the film works, the works which are put into the center of the room, the conceptual works, like on the floor, and this last the room of meditation. And yeah, it's a very different point of view, I think. And so your project involved the display, this exhibition part, also in a curatorial way, a selection of works, of letters, of artworks, and there is also a work, a bone broth, eine Knochensuppe, Knochenbrühe. That you suggested to do. The idea came when I visited you in your studio in Vienna. We talked about that he likes to cook this bone soup after his own recipe, and so it's produced from this the foot of a pig, from oxtail, I think from the bones, and these are, let's say, often materials, or materials is not a good way to say it, but parts of the animals that are often just thrown away and not used. And so also here was the idea to take up this idea of cooking and make something out of it. So do you want to tell something about the project?
We were discussing also on the way to the soup, we were discussing also one of his last letters where he wanted to where he asked somebody to get all his works back. Finally, so he was struggling with this guy or with this situation, and was quite harsh writing, and he said that he will die soon. He wrote he will die soon, and he wants to make a foundation for artists in need. And I thought, yeah, wow, it's such an interesting thing, no, to think about in such a situation about these things, about such a interest. And then we were discussing how could we also initiate something. And around this discussion, the soup was turned up, because I was also cooking the soup. I think I cooked, so during winter times I cooked these soups for several days. You cook these bones, and it's very healthy, and soup anyway is a great dish in any situation. and so we were thinking, and I was thinking about also about food, the project that he was part of, where they also focused on such things. And I remember there was a dish on a photograph you can read, Matta bones, so where he cooked the bone marrow, and so, and I also thought that think that the bones are kind of, the skeleton of structure of a body, like the skeleton you can compare it to skeletons of buildings and of society, whatever, and then we thought that this soup could be a dish for the winter time, for to help people.
Yeah, for people in need. So it will be
people in need. Yeah,
it will be produced and distributed via the Curator Salzburg and Aid Foundation to people in need.
Yeah, and also therefore we would have a connection to the outside. Yeah, so this is also something that I think is interesting, or to
Thank you. Yeah. So thanks a lot for the talk now. Now I would invite, let's say, for a short discussion, Martien and Yann on the podium together with us, so that we can answer some questions. Thank you. Okay, thanks a lot for the talk, for the lecture, for the insights. So I just want to ask you if you have a question to. I'm sure you are interested in one or two things to ask Martien, Yann, or Hans. Everybody happy? Yep.
Thank you so much for giving us these insights into how archives can be made productive, and also these various forms of digging into the material. I have two questions. One to Yann Chateigné. When you I think when you mentioned that Gordon Matta-Clark was using his books as a set of tools, I think you said, I was wondering, they must be full of notes and annotations by him. I was wondering if you had time to maybe trace his thoughts, maybe from one book to the other, from, I don't know, his library to his work, and also if there's a documentation of these notes and annotations. And my second question goes to Martien de Vletter. There's this very beautiful book on Gordon Matta-Clark's archival material, I think published by the CCA, which contextualizes the archival material and the work. I was wondering if you could say one or two words about how this beautiful book was conceived.
Yeah, thanks for this great question. Actually, yes and no, meaning in the collection there is a little bit more than 100. I think there are 100 documents in the selection that we've made, but there are more than 70 books, and I went through all of them and focused on some specific books that were particularly, for me, meaningful and who would allow me to sort of go into each of these 4 constellations. So I was very surprised to see how precisely they were annotated sometimes, and most of the time he was selecting full sentences and sometimes specific set of words, and I had this feeling that his method was really the same as when he was cutting into objects or architectures and buildings. So he was, I think, using these books as materials, ideas becoming a sort of substance, and words becoming, I would say, almost sculptural materiality that then were sort of transferred into his own writing. So sometimes you could feel that he was almost cutting some sentences and sort of decomposing them and recomposing new sentences, especially in the interviews. It's very striking, or sometimes in letters, because he was also removing words, placing new words, and then it became texts that were extremely evocative and poetic and deep and profound, made out of existing other texts. So that's what I meant by also tools, because it was really a practice. He was really practicing text, linguistic as scripture. And also you can feel that sometimes such this specific word or this specific idea removed from its context and recontextualized somewhere else became an idea for a work, or a way to sort of describe something, a process, or to sort of conceptualize an existing gesture that he made perhaps more intuitively. So there was a sort of movement between the books, the library, and the outside, the city, and lots of interviews or texts by him or on him at the time were also evoking the idea that his work was a form of poetry using walls and space and light. So there was even a book that has been published recently that's called Physical Poetics. So it's something that was more and more evident in my this first research that I did, and I couldn't go further because of lack of time, and also because it would maybe require an entire life to go through all these books and understand everything. But well, of course, it's impossible to understand everything. But that the books and the studio and the city were like sort of mirror spaces, and that at some point I had the feeling to navigate through these books as if I was navigating a sort of landscape, as if I was also exploring a city. So there's a sort of analogy in this sense, and this is why also we use these shelves, is also to emphasize this idea of transition, like the books are here now, they were there before, and they were moved, and they are to be used and not placed in a vitrine that is perhaps more like a tomb.
Yeah, now that I think of it, the books and all the annotations, it would be nice to digitize maybe some of them and to make them available online. So I'll take that back home and see if I can convince my staff to do so. I think there's all kind of rights issues there, but who knows, we'll see what happens. Not of Matta-Clark necessarily, but of the book and publishing aspect of it. So that brings me to your other question, the book itself. Yeah, I didn't mention that. So thank you for the question. Yeah, so we published the book after the exhibition at the CCA, after the 3 iterations. So there were, here you see them all together, which is really great. And it's interesting for me because I saw them one after the other in Montreal, obviously, which was a way, I think it's a good way to conceive it. I'm not sure if it would work if we would have all the researchers at once at the CCA coming up with one show. I actually think that would have been very complicated in many ways. So it worked as a kind of iteration of shows. And then, of course, the book was a way already to put it together. And then this opportunity is fantastic for us to make it alive again. We were talking about it yesterday, that it is very strange to shows that we see as 3 different shows, to put them together. But I think the book, actually making the book, helped that process for us a lot. And the book tells you, I think what we've tried to do in the book, and it is a similar structure as the earlier book on the Abalas and Herreros archive, for which we also had 3 researchers, as I was saying, doing 3 exhibitions, or each one exhibition, and then put together as a book. So the book is a similar format. It's one of our larger formats, the largest, I think, because we show archival material, and we try to, especially with documents, let's say obviously a drawing is often bigger than a book, but especially with letters, it allows you the larger format to actually show them the size they really are. So that's one aspect to it, to make sure that you kind of capture this archival understanding of materials, and then also, let's say, even though the 3, let's say, stories about, in this case, Gordon Matta-Clark, are let's say, it's still in the book separate stories, they also kind of are woven together with also images of the exhibition, which also you can only do after an exhibition, after the 3rd one. So yeah, that's how it. And we're going to do another project with the same format on an archive, a very different project with an archive that we just received from Amancio Williams, an architect who worked in Buenos Aires. And especially in the, let's say, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And we still have to process it, so we will work again, processing while inviting the residents, and we'll do a book again. Yeah. Did that answer your question?
I have a question for Hans. You read all his letters, and perhaps you became most intimate with him. And the question would be, what was actually his attitude towards museums? So his stage was quite a different one. He wanted to express himself publicly. So how would he feel about being exposed in a museum, or what was his attitude towards museums?
Yeah, with museums, actually there is not so much correspondence about with museums, because it started, I think, the very end, of his career to work on such proposals, but the correspondence is very much with realities, with producing companies, with galleries, of course, with gallery shows, but actually his you could, I mean, you can read it also in the book, but what you can see and what you can feel is somebody who is trying to force something, to forcing people and forcing two people to help him or to find materials, to find buildings, to finding possibilities. So it's really, you can feel the pressure, the need, and but also the form, the very accurate form of the letters, no? How he writes, and yeah.
I think the museum is a very specific social place. And I think he worked, of course, with museums and galleries, but he was looking for other social spaces to work with, where he can directly work with specific groups of people, with specific neighborhoods.
I'm just having an idea, because he was so much also, working with the photographic lens, looking through the lens, and to have an object. Was English objective, a lens?
A lens, yeah.
Lens. Mm-hmm. And the lens, you could say, you shoot with the camera, so it's about shooting, getting, in connection, and it's also he's writing like he shoots. You could say, like you write letters, like you shoot photographs, and also looking at the invite card. This also could be an enormous lens. Like looking outside of buildings or looking into buildings, and like opening up, and because it's very often this circular form, and so it follows a little bit this principle also, in my sense.
Yeah. Thank you. Are there? Yeah.
I just wanted to mention something I forgot about the annotations. I just thinking now that no, it's important to also to precise that I think the most annotated book in the collection is actually the only one that is actually a book of one could say fiction. It's a book by John Milton from the 17th century called Untitled Paradise Lost, and it seems to be a very important to have been very important for Gordon Matta-Clark for many reasons, personal reasons, but also the themes that are in the book that are full of evocations of family relationships. Between brothers, between a man and his father, and anyway, he really intensively wrote in the book remarks, etc., and makes me think that it's important to precise that there's a whole other part of the collection that are the books that are of fiction and poetry. That are not present in the collection in Montreal, that remain in the hand of the estate, and that perhaps a second chapter of the exhibition would be to include these books that I didn't have the possibility to access, but they are still to be inventoried, and they're in boxes, in crates, somewhere to be excavated. So if someone listens and could support this second part of the research, and I'm still alive at this moment, I'd be happy to be perhaps involved.
You volunteer.
Yeah. Okay, please. There are two questions.
Thank you very much. I have a question to the first space, to Yann. How did you arrive to the idea to install the photographs? Why did you blow them up? Because I was quite irritated to stage a work of art somehow, because coming back to the white cube, it's of course everything that it's exposed in the white cube is transformed to art. And we know Christopher Williams or other photographers that use this explicit view of the detail. And of course, it's your subjective view or gaze on the archive. And then you even put them in Polaroid shape. This or somehow the graphic design. So what derived you to do this?
Mirabelle, could you please also hand over the microphone to Miss Crawford? Would you give us your question also?
Mine is not a question, it's just...
okay. Okay. So we will have Yann first and then... Okay, thank you.
So as I was mentioning before, the exhibition is based on a collaboration between myself and the team of curators, designers, and historians at CCA, and we had problems and we had to find solutions. So the first main problem was how to show books that are full of pages that became precious because of their historical value and because they are annotated by the artist in an exhibition where you can't access the content. So we had three solutions. The first one was to show the books closed, so to show the cover. The second one was to show the books open at one specific double page. And the third one was to reproduce the books and give them accessible to the audience. So one scenario was to photocopy all the books and to do facsimiles and to show the facsimiles in the form of a library for the public to read actually the books. But in the end, for many different reasons, we evolved to another solution. And this solution was to have these shelves with the books on the shelves and to photograph some specific pages to give a little insight of what's inside the archive or what's inside. So the graphic design was the design of the shelf was made by CCA's exhibition designer, and photographs and the graphic design was made by two other persons, one photographer and one graphic designer, Joris Kritis, who was free to also create something out of the research. So the idea was also that the research generates a possibility for a graphic designer to interpret what was done. So I understand this ambiguity, and I personally like it, but I understand that it could be a bit irritating because it's true that you don't really know the status of these pictures. But in a way, I like the change of scale, and I really like it here, very largely printed like this, because it also immerses, I think, the viewer into the environment that could be perhaps a little bit dry without these generous pictures, but I understand your remark. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Well, I wanted to congratulate both you, Yann, and you, Hans, for finding out Gordon's little secret. He was a poet at heart. He started out working with the poets in New York City and got into dancing, physical poetry with the dancers, and learning about more about architecture through moving through it. And no one ever talks about that. But you have touched it. I mean, after he died, most people just thought he was a vandal and wasn't quite sure, how seriously they could take him. But you've really touched on who he was, and as sad as that last letter was, Hans. Again, you touched on it because. As his father said, poetry is important. We need poetry because you may need it in a very important part of your life. And he did, and you caught it. Thank you.
So thank you very much also for this remark. And we will now have a short break of 15 minutes, I would suggest, and we will start at 5 minutes after 4 p.m. Again, let's say 15 minutes with the lectures I'm looking much forward to by Jessamyn Fiore and Catherine Aste about the influence of Gordon Matta-Clark on social practices in art and on architecture. And I think this will be two really interesting lectures and presentations which we will here now after the break. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah. Oh, wait, let me grab my phone. So I'm doing this. Okay, hello everybody. My name is Jessamyn Fiore, and I am the co-director of the Estate of Gordon Matta-Clark with my mother, Jane Crawford, who is married to Gordon Matta-Clark. She's Gordon Matta-Clark's widow, and you heard her give a comment at the end of the last section, so just to give you a bit of context there. I have a short amount of time, about 20 minutes, to talk about a very big topic. And so what I'm going to do is just kind of touch on a few things and then some ideas in Gordon's own work that I think are really relevant to contemporary art being made today. And then end on just a couple big examples of who's responding to Gordon Matta-Clark now. In this brief time, I want to draw out an element that I see as key to understanding not only Gordon Matta-Clark's evolution as an artist, but is what continues to make him not only relevant, but sometimes even prescient of art that is being created and debated today. Now, this element to Matta-Clark's practice had no official art historical designation in the 1970s, but now one could definitely place it under the umbrella of social practice or participatory or community-based or relational art. And it is commonly said that Gordon Matta-Clark is considered an artist's artist. And I think this designation stems from the inherent generosity in his work. That is, he invited participation and opened up space for collaboration, not only to those in his own time, that is, other artists or audience or really anyone who was around, but he carried that invitation is carried into the future. So many artists, even artists who were born after he died, still see him as an ally and a peer today. And I think that's because in his work, he asked questions, he presented possibilities. In his work, he didn't give the answer. He asked the question, and he said, well, I did this, what could you do? And so in this way, he presented possibilities, but left it to you to follow through on them. So in terms of his art historic influence, one could argue that when the ideas around participatory art as an aesthetic in and of itself began to be articulated in the 1990s, Gordon Matta-Clark was cited as an immediate, though historic, creative ally. And he was, in a way, a precursor to a new generation of artists that the curator Nicholas Bourriard grouped under the movement title Relational Aesthetics. So here I just have a couple quotes from Bourriard's book from 1998, where he's defining relational aesthetics and relational art. And I want to say that obviously this movement in the 90s didn't stop then, and in fact, the idea of social practice and relational art continued to evolve, and there were many great curators and writers and artists and thinkers who built on this, responded to it, critiqued it, argued with it. You know, it's been an ongoing process basically from then to today. I'm referencing Bourriard because he was very early in sort of trying to define what this new type of art making was, and because he directly references Gordon Matta-Clark, which I think is useful. So here is a quote where he talks about Gordon, just to say, so the setting is widening. After the isolated object, it can now embrace the whole scene. The form of Gordon Matta-Clark or Dan Graham's work cannot be reduced to the things those two artists produce. It is not the simple secondary effects of composition, as the formalistic aesthetic would like to advance, but the principle, acting as a trajectory, evolving through signs, objects, forms, gestures. The contemporary artwork's form is spreading out from its material form. It is a linking element, a principled dynamic agglutination. An artwork is a dot on a line. And I actually think that this is a pretty good interpretation of Gordon Matta-Clark, although I would think rather than a straight line that the dots of the artworks are on, we could maybe think and look at his drawings that it's a dot on an arrow flying off in every direction, or perhaps a leaf or blossom on an energy tree. Because the principle and the purpose driving Gordon Matta-Clark flowed through everything he did. Writing, drawing, dancing, cooking, eating, talking. All of it was the art. All of it was the work. And I think with the previous talks, you've already gotten a sample and a feeling for that. But just to say that this principle, yes, it's found, of course, in the monumental architectural interventions he undertook, which is what he is most famous for. But I would like to say that it is also just as importantly found in his performance of making those cuts, of physically grappling with the building's material and transforming it, and using that as an example. The history of the empty structures that he was given permission to cut ran headlong into the fraught politics of their obsolescence. And the meaning projected onto this architecture was polarized. It was a reflection of the powers determining the future of our cities, and it was a reflection of the communities who were losing their sense of place and agency. And I'm showing these works of conical intersect and splitting because particularly in these, the context of these buildings was controversial. The change that was happening in these neighborhoods that led to these buildings being razed. Gordon really put himself in the middle of an argument. And so it is the living presence, the performance of Gordon Matta-Clark in which he physically, painfully, alters the material to evolve this architecture. Here we find our path to the beating heart of his work. Embodying and enacting monumental physical change points to the potentiality of societal change, the artist as instigator, the artwork creating real world change for the betterment of the entire community, right? So this is what he proposes. But is this really possible through art? And if it is possible, how is it possible? And I think it's just as important to recognize that Gordon Matta-Clark kept asking himself those questions, that he was not satisfied with these answers, that he kept interrogating himself as to how was this actually creating change? How was he connecting with people and creating real change? So I'm going to turn just briefly to give you an overview of his projects that were more what we would call social practice-based, in order to kind of circle back to these larger ideas. So just a bit of history. After graduating from Cornell University, Gordon Matta-Clark moved down to New York City and got a loft with a studio, and he became a part of a kind of loose collective of artists that based themselves around the space 112 Green Street, which he helped open with Jeffrey Liu and Alan Surratt. And this was basically a artist-run, independent, rough and ready space in Soho, and it housed a multidisciplinary, cross-pollinating creative hive in which he experimented and collaborated from 1970 to 1974. And so in this period, I think of 112 as his kind of laboratory. He tried a lot of different things. A lot of his ideas were expressed in this moment. For example, he was always really interested in the organic. And so these drawings of trees, he was exploring the architecture of trees, the energy of trees. He was very interested in sort of the potentialities of the organic in the transformation of our lived everyday life. And he was really interested in gardens and community gardens, and even did a series of proposals for what he called hit-and-run gardens, where he wanted to find empty lots and go in the middle of the night and turn it into a beautiful garden so that the people of the neighborhood would wake up the next morning with this surprise of the beautiful garden. And he also did proposals for floating islands to go along the Hudson, these sort of floating parks. And this was a project he discussed with Robert Smithson, so Robert Smithson also did an interesting series of proposals. So there was the organic and the sort of bringing nature and the interaction of the society and the community with nature in an urban environment. He also was really interested at that moment in looking at sort of the basic building blocks of architecture, that is bricks, walls, the fundamentals, and how could those be made and created to address the very serious homelessness crisis that was afflicting New York City at this time. How could one make a dwelling that, rather than cardboard boxes or a lot of the sort of materials of the homeless encampments that he would go and observe, something that was durable and renewable and made from the material of the space itself. And so he started by exploring these ideas around garbage walls, making walls out of garbage, and so then you can kind of build a dwelling that would be able to withstand the elements. And also, it's a little hard to see, but the image there, the glass plant winter garden, this was, he collected a whole bunch of bottles from underneath the Brooklyn Bridge, and this is also underneath the Brooklyn Bridge, and melted them down into glass bricks. So again, really early ideas around recycling, and if these could be potential solutions of how we could create more sustainable housing for the homeless population. And then, oh, here he is making a garbage wall underneath the Brooklyn Bridge. And then I think another important part of sort of his work during this period and how it was participatory was that a lot of his artworks were stages, too, and were intentionally used as stages. And so this is a piece of his called Open House, where he got a dumpster and placed it between 112 Green Street and 98 Green Street, and he kind of put up walls and doors within it, so it had a sort of house structure, a little bit of a labyrinth. But then he invited the Natural History of the American Dancer, which was a dance company housed at 112 Green Street, to activate the piece with a performance. And you've heard dance come up a few times. That's Natural History of the American Dancer. And there's Gordon. Dance was really important. 112, not only were there visual artists involved, but there were dancers, there was musicians, there was filmmakers, there's basically everybody, and everybody was collaborating with everybody else. And Gordon even danced for Trisha Brown, and he would dance in performances at 112 Green Street, and then he would make these work and invite the dancers to activate it. The film of this work is available out there to watch if you want to see it in action. It's really beautiful, really joyful. So if you're interested in this part of his practice, I highly recommend sitting down and viewing it. But I think, and this has already been touched upon, probably one of the main pieces and the piece that has had the biggest impact when we talk about Gordon and social practice is food. Food in Gordon's practice was there really from the beginning. And again, I'm going back to underneath the Brooklyn Bridge in 1971. So this exhibition was organized by Ilana Heiss, and it was called Brooklyn Bridge Event, and she invited all these artists to make site-specific works underneath the Brooklyn Bridge, which is a really radical concept of an exhibition at that moment. And Gordon really wanted to do something to reach out to the community that was living around that space, the children that would come and watch them make works, and sort of, you know, make fun of them and make comments, and also the homeless population that was living there. And so he thought, obviously, the best way to start this conversation, to build these bridges, these relationships, is food. And so he got a pig and he roasted it underneath the Brooklyn Bridge, and he invited everyone who's around to come and eat and share and talk and just try to break down these boundaries between, you know, the artists and the artworks and just who lived there and who was also using these spaces and occupied these spaces. He would continue to incorporate food in a lot of his other works. This is another example of the second iteration of Open House. He did it again, but he built a platform on it, so it became a duplex, which is sort of a joke. And then on top of that, so we call it Dumpster Duplex, he did a barbecue then, and again, invited everybody. But of course, the culmination of the food activities really is captured in Food Restaurant, which was opened in 1971 with Gordon and his girlfriend at the time, Carol Gooden, who was a dancer, and as well as Tina Gerard, who's standing in the background, who's an incredible artist and performer, and also very key in the 112 Green Street group. Food Restaurant was kind of like an extension of 112 Green Street in that it was a space where that artistic community sort of created and occupied. Now, I think, well, food as a restaurant, as a business, was run by, you know, a number of people. I think when people think about food as an artwork, it's Gordon Matta-Clark. And why that is that for him, it wasn't just a restaurant. And yes, it served a really vital role of being able to provide jobs for people who needed jobs. It gave meals to people, even if they couldn't afford to pay the meal, it would give away the meal for free. But Gordon always approached every aspect of it as an artwork. So for example, that's food filled with people. When they were renovating the space to turn it into the restaurant, Gordon cut away a section of the wall to reveal the counter, because it actually had an open kitchen, which was very unusual at the time. But again, to sort of open up the cooking process as part of the experience of eating. And so he removed this part of the wall, and rather than, you know, throwing it away, he took it and put it in his first solo show at 112 Green Street alongside a photograph of where the removal was. And this, along with his Bronx floor cuts, were the very first cut pieces that he did. And he displayed them together in 112, thus giving equal weight to this act of construction, renovation, in Food Restaurant, as it was to the Bronx floors, which were very intentional, you know, interventions in derelict spaces, abandoned housing projects in the South Bronx. In addition to that, and this has been touched upon, food wasn't just a restaurant, it was a stage. And it was a stage for food performance. And different artists and also different kinds of chefs would be invited to create meals, and meals that you would never have anywhere else. And Gordon, of course, partook in this. And this is an example of a menu of one of his meals called Mata Bones, where every item is made from a bone or on the bone. And what he did is, if you see this machine down at the bottom, it's a drill. So when you were done with your plate and you'd have the bones left on your plate, he would take your leftovers and clean them, drill a hole through them, put them on a string so you could wear it as a necklace. So basically wear your leftovers home. So they were really fun, playful meals. But again, so like this performance with food, and yeah. He did another one called Alive, where everything was alive, which was an interesting idea, but apparently kind of gross. And then, you know, the final, I think, really important part of food is that he made a wonderful film. And this film is like a day in the life documentary, starting with going to the Fulton Fish Market in the morning and buying the fish. And then, you know, people coming and the food being prepared. And then it ends with the whole group of artists sitting around and talking. And you just really get the sense of this moment and this community and what these interactions. Obviously, that is also in this exhibition, including some really great outtakes. So if you want to immerse yourself in the world of food, you have the opportunity to do so here. So just to jump to, again, so how did this influence people? Well, I think one of, you know, an immediate is Rikrit Tiravanit, who was an artist, again, really involved with relational aesthetics, Gordon. So he did a piece in, let's see, it was titled, Untitled, 1992 Free. It was originally exhibited at 89 Green Street, so physically really close to 112, which was the former 303 gallery space. And so he did this in 1992, and basically he created sort of an installation by taking all of the sort of what would be behind the scenes of the gallery and putting that into the gallery space. And then he cooked these big pots of Thai curry and just invited everyone who came to have a bowl of Thai curry. And this simple gesture was incredibly radical and moving. I mean, when you read accounts of this piece, it comes up again and again of just how deeply people were moved by this. And Rikrit definitely cites Gordon Matta-Clark as an influence. And there was even a show in 2007 at the David Zwirner Gallery in New York where Rikrit recreated this piece. And then we also did a recreation of Open House, the dumpster house, in the same space, so that the artists could be sort of in an active dialogue with one another. So before I get to that, so that sort of brings me up to, it's just Rikrit is a really strong example of, particularly with relational aesthetics, the direct line between Gordon and work that was made and kind of this new context. I think, though, with these movements, or with these works that are about the relationship, the experience, this momentary experience, let's say, of sharing a meal, the question is, well, is that enough? You know, is this interaction, this moment of engagement or conversation, is that enough to create real change? And this is an argument that's been obviously a debate that's been happening for decades around these types of work, but what I think is interesting is Gordon was having this own debate with himself. And so what I would like to propose is an interesting, what I see as a kind of cause and effect in his thinking of from mid-career to the end of his life. So moving from day's end to his proposal from the Arc De Triomphe for workers and resulting in his proposal for a resource center of environmental youth and program for Lower Sida, and which unfortunately was never completed because he passed away in '78. So now I'm going to explain to you what I mean by all of that, because I'm sure you're not too familiar with those last two. So Day's End is a monumental work that he made in 1975, where he cut a pier that had been abandoned by its former commercial use and by the city. Just a little bit of context, the west side of Manhattan had been a very active port. And when the manufacturing base that was, you know, in Soho and lower Manhattan left, so did all of the shipping industries. And the city did not have any money and did not have any plan to redevelop that area. And so all of these piers were just left empty. And in fact, there was a portion of the highway that ran by them that collapsed. And the city didn't even have enough money to fix that. So we're talking about an area of the city that was really not a part of what would be the everyday life anymore. It was the fringe. Now, there was a very vibrant queer scene that grew up and started occupying these piers. And so Gordon was really interested in these spaces and considering, you know, how could he sort of occupy one and transform it. I think I want to bring up here just the conversation earlier with Hans and how you were saying he sent all these letters and there was a flurry of them in the beginning of 1975. And I do think he was really desperate for space, because you should keep in mind that the buildings that he was given permission to cut were all set to be demolished. And in fact, a lot of the times were demolished right after he made his cut. And this was, you know, the only situations that he could find to do these interventions, but he wanted to do something that lasted longer. And he was really intrigued by these pier spaces because they were this site in a city. I mean, Manhattan's an island where you could have access to the elements of water and sky and light, but they were kind of cut off. And so he wanted to create this work and have it be open for a year, totally open to anyone who wanted to enjoy it, where the light could move through the space. But he could no way get permission to do this. He couldn't really get permission to do anything. And so he went and he did it himself. He found this pier. He spent time, saw the piers that were being really actively used by the queer community, and chose one that was not, at that point, being used very heavily, that he describes as being a step from the regular haunts, because he didn't want to disturb. And then he found this pier, and the city had locked it up, but he decided to cut off their locks and just replace it with his own locks, and then sort of seal up some of the holes and things on the side so he could secure the space to do heavy construction. And it was really heavy construction. It was 2 months during the summer, just him and a couple of assistants every single day, making these giant cuts. And also, the hardest and longest part was actually cutting the floor, because you could see how huge those beams are. So this really took months of sawing every day, and until he could make this bisection of the space. Now, this was a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of risk, because it was being done completely illegally. And unfortunately, it was a big disappointment, because a week before what was to be the opening of the space, when the work would be ready and him and his assistant were going to clean the space and make sure everything was safe to allow people in, they were going to take all the locks off the doors, open everything up so it could just be enjoyed. And up until this point, had been really much ignored by the authorities. He hadn't been bothered at all while he was doing all of this massive construction. But a reporter came from the Soho News and saw that, somebody told him about it and saw that this was happening, and they wrote a little blurb saying, okay, next week, this piece by Gordon Matta-Clark's opening in this pier, and the authorities saw it and shut it down. So first, the ports and terminals people showed up and were chasing Gordon away, and he even had to sneak back into the work to finish it. And then the police came and were shutting down the space. And what else is great about this exhibition is that Hille Peleg includes a video of the opening, where the people who attended the opening were sneaking in through the back, but then you can see this huge swarm of police come in, like a lot. And so they came and shut it down. And Gordon, had to leave, and he left for Europe to do Conical Intersect, but there was even like a warrant put out, a detective that was put on the case, and there's this whole correspondence with Gordon and his lawyer, and he had to justify to the city, that he wasn't a vandal, that he was an artist, et cetera, et cetera. And then the city built barricades around the cuts and locked up the space. So when he left for Europe, he really felt like this piece had not ever achieved what it was that he wanted, which is for this space to be not only used by people, but to be there all year long, so everyone could experience each season. So he ended up doing Conical Intersect, which we mentioned, and then he ended up in Milan. And that's where I'm going to talk about the Arc De Triomphe for workers. So basically, this is a building cut that he proposed. This is the drawing. This is really all we have in terms of evidence of it, because it was never done. But the situation was that there was a group of communist students that took over an industrial complex in Sesto San Giovanni outside Milan, and this complex was being slated to be demolished for development. And they were occupying this to protest not only this redevelopment, but to try to bring it back to the people, back to the city. And so they invited the community in to be in the space with them. And they invited people to come and talk. And Gordon was there, and they invited him to come and talk. And he says in an interview how inspired he was by them, how inspired he was by this, that when he looked back at his time on Day's End, he felt so isolated and cut off, and that really, in creating these works, isolating himself and doing that, is that what should happen? Should he not invite the community in, like these communist students were doing, to be a part of the piece? And so his thinking is beginning to evolve of what really, if this is about the community, if this is about connecting with people, is how I'm proceeding, is that actually being the most effective? And so he goes back to New York City and he begins to work on a proposal for a resource center and environmental youth program for Lower Sida. Here I have just quoted directly from Francis Richard, Physical Poetics, which was brought up earlier. If you like Gordon Matta-Clark, get this book. This book is brilliant. Francis Richards, she explores his language, she digs deep into the archives, and she just puts things really well. But basically, yeah, here you have the quote about this project, but the plan was to progress, building by building around the Lower East Side, upgrading dilapidated and fire-damaged structures purchased at extreme discounts from the city, and returning ownership of the rehab properties to the young participants. So he wanted to work with the young people of the community according to a sweat equity system. That is, they would work with him to rehab these structures. He would teach them the skills of how to do this, and then he would turn it over to them so that they could either be inhabited or sold to finance new buildings, right? So it's like a work program. And this is a quote directly from his application to the Guggenheim, and he received the funding from the Guggenheim. But, you know, I mean, here you see that it's not just about the architecture. It is about empowering these young people through teaching them these skills, through teaching them how to transform these spaces and have a voice in the real estate, in the community, but a voice and a stake, and even a monetary stake. And, you know, and he says they could get scholarships then, or if they're not academically oriented, they could create a community-based building construction and maintenance organization. You know, they could basically use these skills to continue to purchase and transform the buildings in this area. And again, just to point out, even at this moment, gentrification was really starting to happen in Soho and then in the Lower East Side. So this neighborhood was not chosen by chance. He was seeing that there were already forces at large that were going to, you know, potentially push out the population who were living there. So he got the Guggenheim grant for this, and then he started writing more to get more support. He was, in 1976, his brother passed away tragically, and that was really difficult, and there were some other projects then that happened in Europe, but he didn't leave this idea behind. He did eventually purchase a building in the Lower East Side, and unfortunately this is only one project that we have documentation of that he was able to try to do with this group, which was in an empty lot, and sort of cleaning that up, and again, going back to the garden idea. And he purchased the building, but then, of course, he got very ill, sort of diagnosed in the beginning of 1978 and passed away in August. But this was still very much on his mind, and I bring it up because I think I personally am so interested that this was where he was going, and that he was interrogating himself about what his interactions as an artist were with the community, and was it enough just to have a relationship, or should he empower? Should he give the tools? Should he give the resources? Should he help really try to help people make change? And I think that that's where he was going with this. Who knows what it would have evolved into? But I think that that's, you know, sort of an extremely relevant point for where we are with contemporary art today, and particularly artists that do work in a community-based context. This is questions we always have to ask ourselves. So I'll just finish up quickly by mentioning two examples of Gordon Matta-Clark's influence today. The first one is a piece that you all might be familiar with. David Hammond's brief story was given amazing, amazing artist, one of the most important artists of America of the 20th century now. He was given a tour of the Whitney, the new Whitney, when it was being constructed by the director Adam Weinberg. And Adam was basically saying, David, anything you want to do. David didn't respond, but at one point, Adam pointed out the window where the new Whitney is and said, down there, that's where the pier was that Gordon Matta-Clark cut for Days End. Now, the pier had been torn down in 1973 79, in March of 1979, but you can still see the pilings sticking up out of the water. And so at the time, David didn't say anything, but then, a little while later, Adam receives this sketch in the mail with no explanation at all. But yes, it was originally titled Gordon Matta-Clark Monument. And I think at first, Adam admits this, he didn't really know what it was. He's like, oh, this is nice. And it took him a while to realize, oh, it's a proposal. And so Adam got an amazing engineer and an architect and a group together and met with David Hammons and said, okay, we think we can do this. And David Hammons is incredibly enigmatic. It's like, okay, you know. And, but they did, and he raised the money to make a permanent public sculpture. It's not owned by the Whitney, it's a gift to this people of the city of New York, which is a perfect outline of the pier of Days End on the site of Days End. And it's very ghost-like, it's like a drawing, but it's also very solid, it's permanent. It speaks not just to Gordon Matta-Clark, it does in its title, because it's titled Days End as well. But it speaks to the history of the piers on the west side, most of which have been torn down. It speaks to the prehistory of that. It speaks to this site in a city and everything that was once contained in that space or passed through that space. So this just opened earlier this year, and yeah, it's a pretty special work. It also has no lights on it, so it disappears as the sun sets, and it disappears if a fog rolls through. It's really poetic. So that's kind of on a grand scale. And now I want to cite a project that you probably don't know. There's a group in Grand Rapids, Michigan called Site Lab. And what they do is they take over disused and abandoned spaces, and they basically give amazing support to artists to come in and do site-specific installations. They're massively influenced by Gordon Matta-Clark. And they were founded in 2010, and they kind of have to move around the city to these different spaces. But in 2015, they were given 4 acres of the city. So it was an entire neighborhood that was, basically this neighborhood had, you know, kind of dissolved. The church had closed, the school had moved away, and Habitat for Humanity, which is an organization that we have in the US that builds new housing for low-income families and communities, bought these acres. And they were going to basically raise all the buildings that were there and build a new community build new homes and everything for the community that was there that would be more functional. But it took them, Habitat for Humanity knew it was going to take 2 years for them to get all the permits and everything in place. So they gave these 4 acres to Site Lab to basically have 2 years of inviting artists to directly intervene, not just with the architecture, but with the history and with the community, to address, you know, what this situation was, how did they end up here, and what is the future going to behold. And they wanted Gordon Matta-Clark central in that conversation as the kind of historic touchstone for what was happening in that space. And so the old mechanics garage, they turned the bays into screening rooms, so we could screen Gordon's films. And then, I'm just going to show you some examples. You know, here are some buildings. This was a whole intervention with 3 structures where it was really questioning this idea of accessibility, which I'm sure we know with museums in particular, how accessible are spaces. And they worked with a group called DisArt, which is all about creating accessibility in art spaces for disabled people. And then, you know, here's another project, moving a house. Julia Scheckelberg did this incredible sort of taking apart and weaving back together of this structure. This is Diana Shipton, graphite drawing of a house that is completely drawn, that house, with pencil. She covered every surface with graphite, and it really was amazing. And here's an example of DisArt. So I just wanted to use them as a way, as like I see that contemporary artists and contemporary art groups are taking not just social practice, but community engagement and empowerment, and using them today, working with contemporary artists today, but having Gordon Matta-Clark there as kind of the grandfather of all of this. So, thank you.
Yeah, hello, a warm welcome to you all, and many thanks, Jürgen, for inviting me to give this lecture, in which I'm going to speak about the importance of the work of Gordon Matta-Clark for architecture, and maybe for some relationships with a focus on Austria. And forgive me, since I am not an expert, I approach this from my personal point of view. Maybe it opens up a new context for you too. Gordon Matta-Clark's influence on architecture is indisputable on the one hand and extremely complex on the other hand. I think there have been only a few artists who had such an impact on the architectural discipline in the second half of the 20th century. The reason for this seems to be the complexity of Matta-Clark's work, which includes an immense wealth of projects, sketches, and fragments in various media. In addition, his work is individual and collective. It's performative and documentary, and equally strategic and spontaneous, which makes it an open and rich source of inspiration. Insofar, it is not surprising that his work, which oscillates between the architectural and artistic discipline, has inspired so many architects and continues to do so. I agree with Philipp Ursprung's thesis that Matta-Clark's work is a reflecting surface that acts like a mirror for architects, a mirror that shows architects the limits of their possibility and thus also their potential. The west wall of Day's End, what you have shown already in such an amazing way, at Pier 52, which we see in this picture, holds such a mirror up to us. While Matta-Clark himself explored the boundary between art and architecture in a performative manner on buildings, he put the architectural praxis up for discussion, a discussion that continues to this day and is still posing questions like, what is architecture? Or what are we dealing with when we talk about architecture? It seems as if we lost in the middle of the 20th century, or perhaps even earlier, the feeling for what architecture can or should be and what we can expect from it. If we understand architecture as a discipline that assumes its extensive responsibility in dealing with the environment and the built space, both in spatial and aesthetic terms, as well as in social and ecological terms, then asking critical, precise questions is more important than offering quick solutions. Gordon Matta-Clark's art is an art of critical questioning, and in this sense, an essential invitation to all architects to do so. With the term Unarchitecture, the so-called group of artists from whom Matta-Clark played a central role confronts us with a subversive puzzle that Mark Quigley, the architectural theorist and former dean of Columbia University's Architecture School, wonderfully dissects and thus questions about the nature of architecture. I let him do this introduction to this term, Unarchitecture.
And this word, what kind of word is this? An architecture, right? It's a funny word. It is a self-undoing word. It's a word that undoes itself, right? At first, maybe the first reaction, an architecture must be not architecture, right? But just as you sort of swallowed that thought, then you kind of go, well, wait a minute, but the word an architecture is still kind of there, so it's not an architecture either. Right? So just the first like flash of this word is it's not architecture, and it's also not architecture. But it's not, you know, so it's like an architecture, right? It just like, it could also be just architecture that's like not that important, and it's an architecture, right? Or it's an architecture, like Le Corbusier towards an architecture, right? So even the word "an" could be not architecture, or it could be just architecture, or it could be the architecture, right? And it's in that word. You couldn't help but have heard these things. I'm just rehearsing what maybe went on in your mind. Then of course it has also, anarchy is clearly there, right? So now we've got architecture still there. It's not architecture and it's not architecture. And it could be architecture big or architecture small, but it could also be kind of an anarchy of architecture. It could be architecture really becoming anarchistic, like it's even there, anarchitecture. But if it's anarchitecture, then it might be not so much architecture heading towards anarchy as anarchy heading towards architecture, right? Like anarchy would have like an architecture, like the structure of anarchy. Or at least it's all of these things, right? There's definitely a smell of anarchy in this word, but nothing's really being damaged or dissolved or destroyed, certainly not architecture. Architecture is still hanging around.
And there are even more modifications of the term an architecture, what may lead us to an understanding of architecture that is able to act subversively, politically, socially, and sensitively, and liberates the architect from the fatal situation of an externally controlled agent. I'm sure that every artistically ambitious and critical architect will gladly accept this challenge. As a teacher, I know that young students of architecture tend to have a system-critical, an anarchistic and idealistical spirit, and that they want to change something for the better. Let us not forget that the architecture faculties were important engines of the 1968 student movement. I think it lies in the nature of architectural design to free oneself from an aesthetic doctrine and to counter repressive ideas. In 2015, for example, the ICA, the Institute of Art and Architecture of the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, started a research project called NEST. NEST, which stands for New School of Thought, was founded to debate the nature of learning, teaching, and researching in the field of architecture. The fundamental question arose as to how and whether architecture can be taught. In order to begin this journey, the faculty of the ICA decided to research this question together with all students along different studios. In addition to other references, it was above all Gordon Matta-Clark's own biography and his reflections on architecture that raised the necessary questions. What the studio brief von Ernst Fuchs illustrates with an image of Matta-Clark's conical intersect from 1975. Beside Gordon Matta-Clark's conical intersect, there are movies such as Samrock by Claude Faraldo, or the explosion scene from Antonioni's movie Zabriskie Point, which young students see very often during their studies, even before they have made any design. Friedemann Malsch wrote about this relationship already in Kunstforum, published in 1992. Why does one show young students pictures of the deconstructions of a building instead of construction? Quite simple, in order to literally shatter their previous understanding of architecture and everything they think they know about it. Many of Matta-Clark's projects in the early 1970s, such as the so-called building cuts, are characterized by a radical gesture of deconstruction. But Matta-Clark, as we can really wonderfully see in the films, gesture was deconstruction is, also the gesture of deconstruction is not a deconstruction of the given structure, but rather a carefully removal of layers in order to change the existing structure and thereby enabling different perspectives. Formal concerns were not in the foreground, but rather socially critical motifs. Matta-Clark says, by undoing a building, there are many aspects of the social conditions against which I am gesturing. To open a state of enclosure which has been preconditioned not only by physical necessities, but by the industry that profiligates suburban and urban boxes as a context for ensuring a passive, isolated consumer, a virtually captive audience. To this he adds, the fact that some of the buildings I've dealt with are in black ghettos reinforces some of this thinking, although I would not make a total distinction between the imprisonment of the poor and the remarkable subtle self-containerization of a higher socio-economic neighborhood. Matta-Clark thus addresses the resistance, liberation from his partly voluntary, partly involuntary self-containerization and seems to propagate a more open, flexible understanding of space that defines space as a field of operation rather than a container. The awareness that architecture can or must make a spatial contribution to combating social injustice can be traced back to the 1960s and 70s. There are certainly many parallels to Matta-Clark in the work of the Viennese avant-garde or other Austrian architects of this era. At this point in time, however, Matta-Clark was not a direct reference. This came later. With the Food City project, Hausrucker Co. brought in 1971 urban problems to public awareness in a delicious way. Passers-by were asked to destroy obsolescence by gobbling the city up. The edible, playable, and portable architecture of the group embodied the idea of an ephemeral and expandable architecture. Günter Feuerstein, the Austrian architect and architectural theorist, he is 97 today, is not only a contemporary witness of these movements, but has also significantly influenced them in Austria. In his book, Günter Feuerstein, Zeitzeuge 100 Jahre Architektur, he reports about this time and documents the most important influences on the Austrian architecture scene. You can see this on the list. In it, I found this interesting list that shows that, of course, depending on the supra-regional and regional influences, a cultural context with quite surprising overlaps is formed. I appreciate Feuerstein's explosive mixture of philosophy, pop culture, art, technology, and politics. Maybe most or some on this list could also have been an important factor in Matta-Clark's mindset. There is also mentioned the Berlin Wall, for example. So let's stay with the Berlin Wall for a moment. 1976, Matta-Clark came to Berlin with the intention to blowing up part of the Berlin Wall. The project was a sort of anarchism against architectural symbol of power. In the end, he didn't blow up the wall, but rather left critical statements on posters. This project could be contrasted with Günter Domenic's documentation center in the Reichstagsgebäude in Nuremberg. What is also a project that takes a critical position towards power systems and their architecture. Domenic literally pierced the monumental symmetrically Nazi building by throwing a spear into the building of Albert Speer. As with Matta-Clark's cutting, the building is based on an existing structure and its change based on a destructive gesture. While Matta-Clark does not add anything and the incisions stand for themselves, Domenic adds a construction and thus builds a bridge to deconstructivism in architecture. For Günter Domenic, Gordon Matta-Clark was perhaps not a direct reference, but like Matta-Clark, he was a youngster, committed to himself and the intellectual and cultural movements of his surroundings, just as anarchic, perhaps a soulmate. Incidentally, Domenic's father was a well-served National Socialist. The project in Nuremberg was also a harsh critique on him. Maybe we can find another analogy to Gordon Matta-Clark in the early works of the then still young Viennese architecture group Himmelblau. which was founded by Wolf Brix, Helmut Zwiczynski, and Michael Holzer, and was supported by Günther Feuerstein when he was a professor of architecture at the TU in Vienna. Their manifesto, Architektur muss brennen, from 1980, corresponded to the demand of the situationist Guy Debord that architecture must be exciting, or l'architecture doit devenir passionnante. The group's stance can be traced back to both situationist ideas and Jacques Derrida's deconstructivism, thinkers who were also of central importance to Gordon Matta-Clark. On the picture you can see on the left side the restless sphere, and on the right side the project to the manifest, The Blazing Wing, which was installed in 1980 in Graz. Coop Himmelblau were shown in the exhibition Deconstructivist Architecture in 1988 in the Museum of Modern Arts in New York, curated by Philip Johnson and Mark Wigley. Their participation in this exhibition has since led to Coop Himmelblau being recognized as a part of the group of deconstructivist architects. One of their first works, in particular the rooftop in Falkestrasse in Vienna in 1988, testifies to a destructive gesture with a constructive quality. In the attic extension, maybe Matta-Clark would call it an attic torture, one of his architecture declination, which creates space on top of an existing building, the usual categories such as regularity, sequence of symmetry, or traditional architecture are given up for a checked, heterogeneous, and seemingly unstable structure that gives the impression that it could come tumbling down at any moment. As in the work of Gordon Matta-Clark, Coop Himmelblau are pursuing the approach of deconstructing the boundaries of architecture. After his building cuts, Gordon Matta-Clark began the Skyhawks, studies for a balloon building 1978. These studies propose a form of habitable airspace attached to buildings without occupying or urban space, thus avoiding any property speculation. The title of the project, Skyhooks, which may be translated as Wolkenbügel in German, refers to the project of the same name by the Russian constructivist L. Lissitzky, who formulated an alternative form of the American skyscraper in the 1920s. Significantly, in this last project, Matta-Clark combined the Russian utopia with a science fiction and an alternative social living concept for big cities. This and other projects make one believe that Matta-Clark has never given up architecture. We find similar urban concepts by Hans Hollein, Hausrucker Co. and Coop Himmelblau in projects from the 1960s. Hollein also conquered the sky by building a technoid city sculpture of the city of Vienna. Since his studies in Chicago, Hollein has also dealt with alternative concepts of skyscrapers. Hollein described the basic principles of buildings as digging, building up, and forming, while the tectonic building up, which has to obey the rules of gravity, the atectonic hollowing out can freely expand in all directions. A recent example, small step to Germany, a recent example from 2014 that I would like to put up for discussion is the so-called Anti-Villa by Brandlhuber and M. de Schneider. What it has in common with Matta-Clark is not a formal approach, but fundamental considerations about the nature of architecture and the excessive standards that have to be met today. In the middle of the tranquil Potsdam-Kramnitz suburb, the Anti-Villa stands next to the neatly plastered facades of middle-class houses. In the simple former warehouse building, the architects, who are also the owners of this building, they used a sledgehammer to break out new window openings of the existing facade. In doing so, they opened up completely new and surprising views and perspectives. Brandlhover's buildings show how adaptable architecture can be and that he prefers an informal form of reuse to demolition. According to Brandlhover, this has economic and ecological reasons because he says everything that is reused does not initially waste the energy and capital that is already in the property by demolition. As far as I know from interviews, Samrock and Matta-Clark were both important references for Arno Brandlhover. Just as interesting as the anarchic, social, and conceptual aspect in Matta-Clark's work is his sculptural understanding of space. His aim is not to use sculptural ideas for architecture, but rather to make a sculpture out of them. Matta-Clark uses building like an objet perdu. By transforming the existing structure, he addresses it. Through his intervention, he destroys its purpose as a dwelling on the one hand, and on the other hand, he clearly shows what it once was. As this is with splitting in 1974, for example, a boring state single family house in the suburbs. For architecture, it is also interesting that his building cuts refer to that form of architectural presentation which does not clarify the organization of a building like the floor plan, but reveals spatial relationships, the sectional drawing. And in this sense, one can almost say Matta-Clark builds and draws space spontaneously on a scale of 1:1. Matta-Clark treats a building like a sculpture. Using a subtractive approach, he cuts geometric shapes out of a volume. There are many examples in architecture for this sculptural approach. One who came to my mind is the Austrian architect Wolfgang Ciabella. Wolfgang Ciabella heads the Institute of Art and Architecture at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. Ciabella studied in Vienna at the Academy of Applied Arts and at the Cornell University in Ithaca, where he was also a visiting professor. He knows Matta-Clark's work very well, and approaches that were important to Matta-Clark are apparent in many of his projects, such as a study for the administration building of the Federal Insurance Agency that he developed together with Michael Wallraff. In this design, open-use spatial bodies are inscribed in the skeleton construction of an existing structure, as you can see here. Ciabella also designed and planned the new library at Cornell University, into which he integrated a huge walking hanging shelf and thus created an almost Piranesian room. Ciabella's architecture is based on an intensive process of thought and reflection. Ciabella is uncompromising and has never sold himself to a client. Instead of building something that doesn't live up to his attitude, he'd rather not build anything at all. It almost seems as if he had made a commitment to Gordon Matta-Clark. I think we are far away from concluding Gordon Matta-Clark's reference, especially now in the context of a new burgeoning environmental movement. The projects like Tree Dance, which deal intensively with the conditions of a place and our behavior in it, are getting current relevance again. An example that already echoes the idea of recycling architecture, which becomes also obvious at the Open House from 1972. Gordon Matta-Clark has succeeded in embodying visions for an environmental movement through sensual, irritating, and touching interventions. The architect has a social contract with the planet, the environment, and the society. It is not easy to live up to this claim in a turbo-capitalistic world order. I think it is high time we build less, thought more, and developed visions for a positive future. Even if the project I referred to today do not stand up to the work of Gordon Matta-Clark in a theoretical sense, it would still be wrong to attribute certain similarities only to a formal analogy. Ultimately, dealing with Matta-Clark triggers a thought process in all architects and leads to a more reflective design process. In November 2018, Mark Wigley presented his book, Cutting Matta-Clark, The Architecture Investigation at Columbia University. He opened his lecture with the statement, there are a lot of ways to be an idiot in architecture. One of the easiest is not to pay attention to Gordon Matta-Clark. I would like to thank him and all of you for your valuable work in researching Matta-Clark's work and interpreting it for us architects. His work may first and foremost be art, but for me personally, I can also see it as an outcry for a more critical and better architecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessamyn, for your lecture, and also Katrin Aste. I would suggest that we have a final short discussion about what we just heard, about possible connections between art and architecture. Yeah, thanks a lot. You already want to say something. You're already prepared to say something, I think.
I mean, just in general, it hasn't been. Thank you all so much to the museum, to Generali, to the CCA, to the wonderful curators and artists who have been involved in this project. It's deeply moving to hear Gordon Matta-Clark's complexity be considered. And it often doesn't happen. And for him to be considered, you know, as a human being. And I think that is what comes through in the archive. And I think you can see his struggles, and you can see the evolution of his ideas. And then to be able to come here and see the relevance and to learn, you know, more about how Gordon Matta-Clark, how some of these ideas may have been not just manifest in the world, but it's fascinating to see other projects that were happening, that were thinking along these same lines. So yeah, I just want to say thank you. This has really been a fantastic experience.
Thank you so much for this. Thank you. Yeah, do you have any questions, please? Just ask.
Yes, thank you. I have a question to Jessamyn, because I understand your lecture in a way that that was about the potential in the work of Gordon Matta-Clark. And if I understand your lecture correctly, then the next step has been an artist who possibly will have been much more political. So with, you mentioned the community engagement and political empowerment. So that's always, I mean, that's a hypothetical question, but so maybe he will have changed his profession. Is that one aspect in your lecture?
I don't know, but I do think that perhaps for a long time, the politics of Gordon Matta-Clark were ignored in large part. And when I did the exhibition with Sergio Bassa at the Bronx Museum, we really wanted to grapple with that and to sort of put it front and center. And so we put front and center his graffiti works and the Bronx floors and the implications of that. And then we ended the exhibition with the proposal for Lois Saida, because for the youth center that I talked about at the end, because we both felt that there was something that when you really looked at the work and you looked what he was thinking and writing and the direction he was moving in, yeah, there was an agitation there and wanting to do something that perhaps would step into the political realm, that is a kind of active social organization. Unfortunately, we don't know what the consequences would have been. And then also, one has to remember the 1980s happened. So, you know, just in general, with this community that was of artists in Soho, you know, who were, at that time, they were making works that were not commercial. And nobody knew how to make them commercial at that point. But Vito Conci said very well that we sort of made the mistake of teaching the commercial gallerists how to sell our work. And so by the 1980s, the gallerists really figured out how to sell it. So suddenly you had, as my mother says, the fickle hand of fate coming down to these different artists and saying, okay, you're successful and recognized and, you know, you're forgotten about. And unfortunately, a lot of times it was mainly men that were the successful, recognized ones. But it created divisions. And it was a very different art world in the 1980s, which is why I began my talk with the 1990s. Because it was that movement, and it was the artists of the 90s, and it was the artists involved with relational aesthetics and other groups that were looking back to the 70s, because they were rejecting what was happening in the 80s. So it would be a twofold question of where would Gordon Matta-Clark have personally gone, and then how would he have reacted to the environment in the 80s? How would the city of the 80s, if he had gone in a political direction, then when you get into the 90s with Giuliani as mayor, what would have happened? So it's a lot of hypotheticals, but I think what's important is to acknowledge that in the work, and to also, because he cited so much as early social practice, when we talk about artists that engage with the community, we also have to talk about the critiques of those projects. And when we talk about Gordon Matta-Clark, of course there's critiques. But what I just want to point out that I think he was already asking those questions. Now, would he have successfully addressed them? Would he have ever made it to this point that he was wanting to get to? We don't know. But, you know, another thing my mother talks about is that, you know, when he was dying, he said to her she could throw everything away because he never felt like he had really successfully accomplished the work that he wanted to accomplish, that he always had to make compromises. And of course she didn't, which is great. And now we have this wonderful archives in CCA and in Generali. But so I think if we, rather than see him as this icon, and that, you know, and that the works are somehow these solid monuments, if we take a step back and see him also as a human being and as an artist who was desperately writing these letters and trying to get support, you know, or trying to find ways to connect and trying to evolve this work so that it wasn't just meaningful in the moment, but that it could have an impact and create real change.
Just one comment, because the name of Joseph Beuys has not been mentioned today. And it's interesting because the gallerist Tadeusz Ropacz told me when he started his gallery in Salzburg, he invited Joseph Beuys. And Beuys came, but he never ever saw the exhibition. He went directly to the university to work with politics, to make lectures for the students. That was very interesting because he was one of the very important founders of the artist founders of the Green Movement in Germany. So that was art as a political issue. Just a comment, and it started here in Salzburg. That's very nice.
My question is to Asta, and it would be that we saw that Gordon Matta-Clark expressed his ideas in different medias, and architecture was one of that media. And he had quite radical ideas and expressions. Is it still viable in architecture to stay true to his thoughts and ideas, or should we compromise more? Is it still a viable strategy to stay radical?
You mean, or to be more, I don't understand the question, to be honest. You mean if it's still a topic to be radical and
yeah, he was radical in his expression. So like for him, the art was like he doesn't make compromises in the art form, or how he deconstructed the buildings. So should we still pursue the tactics like uncompromisable art? So the art of architecture should still be in front of the.
No, I mean, on the one hand, we see that also Gordon Matta-Clark made compromises. I think it will always be part of the architectural process. I mean, we are dealing with so many people, you know, so many people have to be involved. It's not something we build architecture for us, yeah. So insofar, of course, we have to make maybe compromise, but maybe it's not so much a question of compromise, it's more a question of an attitude or of a stance you have. I mean, you have to have an idea when you want to make architecture, and you have a responsibility, a social responsibility, but also an environmental and an ecological responsibility. And I think this is important that we stand for that, and we try to be responsible for this kind of aims, and not to be to fulfill the ideas of a client, or to fulfill being an agent for investors or something like that. I think this is important, and insofar we have to be careful when we think about if we do compromises. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
May I ask you a last question?
Yeah.
Sorry, pardon. Katrin. Because talking about compromises, I was just thinking of a work that you made, the Landhausplatz in Innsbruck. It's a huge public space that was which is a historically very loaded, politically very burdened place, also from the Nazi era, and it's the regional government has its buildings there, and you had the challenge to work with this place and to make a new layout, a new design for it. And maybe you can just say a few sentences about it, because it also relates to architecture as social practice. Then what the result was, that this connects these two, the two aspects you were talking about, and it shows that you were working on a very narrow margin, in a way, between making compromises and not making many compromises. Maybe you can talk a little bit about this this work.
Yeah, most of you maybe know it, but maybe not everybody. It's the Landhausplatz is a huge square in Innsbruck. It's 9,000 square meters big. You can see it as a floor sculpture. Yeah, it's a sculptural a topography, a landscape out of concrete. Yeah, and there are a lot of so it's a very sculptural project. But on the other hand, there are 4 monuments on it, which 2 of them commemorates the victims of the Nazi era, and it is above the governmental building of Tirol, which is a Gau house, which was planned as a building of the Gau. And so the square we did is it is a certain form of resistance, because it brings the monuments, the recognition of the monuments and the perception. It's into another situation than it was before, because they were all just they were all positioned on an axis, and now they are located in a very different way on the square. And on the other, so it is dealing really very much with the history and the memory of the history of the region. And on the other hand, we really try to figure out for whom are we doing this site. And it's not, Innsbruck is a city where a lot of Gastgarten and a lot of ecological, economical needs and things like that. And we said, okay, we want to give it to a younger, to young people, to people who have not such a voice, and then this kind of really strong shape helped that it gets a kind of resistance, and that it is you cannot do a Gastgarten there, and also the military cannot use it really for
it cannot be used anymore by the Tiroler Schützen, which is a very conservative organization there, which used to make their processions there.
And I think it's also, I always say it's with Reiser and Umemoto, they say that it's exactly the persistence of a form which open it up to freedom. And I think this is also something what Matta-Clark has in his projects, that in the end it's also that he is doing a strong form out of these buildings through his cuts. It changes its perception and also its possibilities. So it's not always that the rectangular square or the most easiest architecture embodies the biggest freedom or possibilities.
Yeah. Karin?
Thank you very much for both talks, but I have a question to Jessamyn. In preparing the visit to the conference, it got obvious to me that maybe Gordon Matta-Clark has a specific perspective on the old Europe, maybe because he started French poesy, studied French poesy, maybe his challenging project was also with this old French building in Paris compared to the Centre Pompidou. And so I thought maybe he had a desire on this old understanding of Europe, and maybe maybe his work is differently received in Europe and in America. Because maybe for us European, gentrification is something very typical for the urban understanding, that you move in artists. This was something that started in America. But this community building projects, that's very lively in the artistic scene, also in Europe. Maybe you already had this experience that European artists differently rework or rethink Gordon Matta-Clark than maybe American artists?
Well, I think that's true, yeah. And I think particularly historically, and my mother can speak better to this, but the Europeans understood what he was doing way before the Americans did in general and recognized it. It was the Europeans and the architects who sort of saw it much before. I mean, particularly if you think about art in America and the institutions and so on. But I hear what you're saying in terms of dealing with the old Europe, and obviously he had incredibly strong family connections to Europe. So he did spend a lot of time in France and in Italy, you know, when he was visiting his father. And I think beyond just working with the materials of old Europe, like with conical intersect in those old buildings, I mean, obviously, these were sites he was given. So, you know, it's always that, I mean, he really embraced that. It was hard work, and was interested in that history and used that then in the design of the cut, which is the cone shape or the lens shape. But it was, if it was a lens of the future, the Pompidou looking through the past, those buildings, and opening onto the present, which is the street scene. So he did embrace that. But I would say he was also fascinated, and it was mentioned briefly here, but it's in the films, the underground of cities. And, you know, when he speaks about the layers of architecture, he talks very clearly that he wants to propose an architecture that's beyond our middle space, that extends into the earth and goes up into the sky. And, you know, and so he did these explorations of the underground in New York, but the explorations in Paris are fascinating. And his stepmother, Malit Mata, would take him and his brother, Batan, down into the sewers when they were children to explore the French sewers underground, because that was kind of a cool thing to do, and they would run into Noguchi down there, you know? And so he was familiar with this underground architecture, but when you watch those films and you see him exploring these layers of history and going into the catacombs, and, you know, I definitely think that there was something very strongly that he was relating to that history. And he also has the beautiful, this beautiful sequence of, well, I don't really know what they're not exactly photo collages, because he exposed different images from like the surface of Paris, and then kind of cutting the strata down below. So you'd have the opera house, and then the layers beneath the opera house all the way down to you know, the gate to the water underneath where the Phantom of the Opera lives, you know, but just sort of as if you could just slice a city and expose these layers. And this was something that, you know, he was doing in Paris, because that's obviously that history, that architecture is there. So I think if I'm understanding you correctly, yes, there is there is definitely I think a sensibility that he shared with this historic architecture that I do think that European artists recognize. And then when they see him doing it in the US, that, you know, there is a context for that. Whereas in the US, I mean, we don't have the same kind of history. And we don't have the same kind of relationship to our architecture, because yes, of course, we didn't invent gentrification, but our cities are not as old. And there can be huge turnovers of population very quickly. And obviously, you know, sort of this late stage capitalism is completely out of control. And, you know, so we see extreme transitions in our cities, you know, particularly in, let's say, like the latter half of the 20th century to now. It's really rapid. And I think there's a lot of people, a lot of artists, a lot of architects, everyone trying to catch up as to, you know, how do we address this? So yes, it's something that Europe has obviously a much longer history with, but I think it's a good observation for sure.
May I ask another one?
The
short one.
The last one, please.
This is maybe a nice last one, because okay. It's not possible to answer, because what would you think Gordon Matta-Clark would do now today? I was discussing this with Katrin Aster when we were driving on the train to this place, but I think it's a nice question. What would you think he would do now? No, I ask both. I ask all you three for an impossible question.
I know that Jessamyn is not the medium.
Yeah, I was saying this last night. It's a skill I need to develop where I can just tune in and get the response.
But maybe it makes also fun to just speculate. Yeah. Why not?
I would say, and you've brought this up a lot, but the developments and particularly environmental considerations. Yeah. I think that was something obviously Gordon Matta-Clark was concerned with early on. Again, who knows what would have happened in the intervening decades, but I think if he was transported to right here, right now, I mean, besides being absolutely shocked by the technology, but I think that the conversations that we are having right now about the environment, about our impact in it, about alternative strategies of how we construct our lived space is so to bring back, if possible, some kind of equilibrium to the natural world just for our own survival. I think he would definitely be very interested in those conversations.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Thank you so much for your contributions, and for your attention, of course. And yeah, I wish you a nice afternoon and evening. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.